The tropical night hung thick over Saipan, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and reduced the world to nothing but the drone of engines and the green glow of instrument panels. It was June 30th, 1944, and Second Lieutenant Dale Haberman sat in the cockpit of a machine that didn't yet have a reputation. The P-61 Black Widow, officially designated Moon Happy, was so new that Japanese intelligence didn't even know it existed. Behind him, Flight Officer Raymond Mooney hunched over the radar scope, watching electronic ghosts dance across a circular screen. The SCR-720 radar painted the night sky in shades of green phosphorescence, each blip representing either salvation or death depending on whose side you were on. Tonight, somewhere in that darkness, Japanese bombers were hunting for the B-29 bases that had just begun pounding the home islands. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The radio crackled. Ground control had detected something. A single contact, inbound from the northwest, flying at 12,000 feet. Mooney's eyes narrowed as he adjusted the gain on his scope. There. A solid return, and beside it, something smaller. The Betty bomber wasn't flying alone. It had brought an escort, most likely a Zero, and both aircraft were heading straight toward the American airfields with their bomb bays full and their crews convinced that darkness still belonged to them. What those Japanese pilots couldn't know, was that the rules of night combat had just been rewritten by a country that could afford to put cigarette lighters in its fighter cockpits. The Black Widow wasn't an adaptation. It wasn't a day fighter with a radar set bolted awkwardly to its nose or a bomber pressed into service as a hunter. It was purpose-built, designed from its first rivet to do one thing supremely well: find aircraft in total darkness and destroy them before they even knew they were being hunted. Haberman eased the throttles forward. The twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, 36 cylinders between them, 4,400 horses of American industrial might, responded with a deep, guttural roar. The Black Widow climbed smoothly through the tropical air, its twin-boom fuselage cutting through the night like a blade. No vibration, no hesitation, just smooth, hydraulic-assisted controls that made the massive fighter respond like something half its weight. This was the fundamental difference between what Japan had built and what America had engineered. Japanese night operations still relied on the old methods, skilled pilots using moonlight and intuition, closing to visual range where a single mistake meant death for hunter or prey alike. The Americans had industrialized the hunt. They'd turned it into a problem of engineering, solved with radar and redundant systems and more ammunition than an entire flight of Japanese interceptors carried combined. Mooney's voice crackled through the intercom. Contact bearing 320, range 8 miles, altitude 12,000. They haven't seen us. His tone carried the flat certainty of a man reading instruments, not making guesses. The SCR-720 radar could paint targets at 4 miles in total darkness, with a clarity that made the Japanese sets look like toys. But tonight, they'd picked up the bomber at twice that range, giving them time to position, to calculate, to turn the engagement into something that looked less like combat and more like an execution. Haberman banked left, bringing Moon Happy onto an intercept course. Through his canopy, he could see nothing but stars and the faint glow of distant thunderstorms. The Betty and its escort were invisible, protected by the same darkness that had sheltered Japanese night raiders for 3 years of war. But invisibility only worked when both sides were equally blind. Range 5 miles, Mooney called. They're holding course and speed. Still haven't detected us. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so terrifying. Somewhere ahead, a Japanese pilot sat in his bomber, confident in the protection of night. His navigator was probably marking checkpoints, his bombardier preparing for the run. The Zero pilot flying escort was scanning the darkness for American night fighters that he'd been told couldn't exist, because everyone knew the Americans lacked the technology for true night operations. They were wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. Range 3 miles. Closure rate good. Recommend we slow down or we're going to overshoot. Mooney's prompts were surgical, professional, guiding Haberman through the intercept with the precision of a ground controller. This was what the three-man crew concept allowed: specialization, division of labor, one man flying while another managed. The radar and a third operated the dorsal turret. Japanese night fighters had pilots who did everything alone, masters of their craft but limited by human biology. The Black Widow had a crew, each member focused on a single task, backed by technology that amplified their capabilities beyond what any individual could achieve. Haberman throttled back. The massive fighter decelerated smoothly, no torque steer, no asymmetric thrust problems. The Americans had solved those issues during development, added hydraulic boost to the controls, balanced the aerodynamics until a pilot could fly this aircraft with 2 fingers on the yoke. It was democratic engineering build the machine good enough that average pilots could do exceptional things. Range 1 mile, target in sight. Correction, targets. I'm seeing 2 distinct returns now, the fighters moving to the bomber's 6 o'clock high. Through the darkness ahead, Haberman finally saw them. Not visually, the night was too thick for them, but as faint silhouettes against the stars. Black shapes moving against black sky. The Betty's distinctive twin-engine profile was unmistakable, and above it, the sleeker form of a Zero, both aircraft completely unaware that death was closing from behind at 300 miles per hour. This was the moment that would be repeated 63 more times in the Pacific before war's end. The moment when Japanese pilots discovered that darkness was no longer sanctuary but hunting ground, where American technology had transformed night into a killing field as efficient as any daylight battle. Haberman closed to 700 feet. At this range, a Japanese night fighter would still be groping blindly, trying to distinguish target from sky. But the Black Widow's radar had painted the Betty in perfect detail, and now Haberman could see it with his own eyes, not clearly, but enough to aim, to calculate, to kill. "You're cleared to fire," Mooney said. The words were barely out of his mouth when Haberman pressed the trigger. 4 20mm Hispano cannons erupted from the Black Widow's belly. In daylight, the crew would have seen tracers, but tonight they'd removed them to preserve night vision. What Haberman saw instead was the effect the Betty's port engine exploding into flame, magnesium burning white hot, the entire fuselage lighting up like a torch as cannon rounds walked from wing root to cockpit. The bomber never had a chance to evade, never fired a defensive shot, never even knew what hit it. One moment it was flying toward its target. The next, it was a falling comet, trailing flame and debris, breaking apart as it plummeted toward the Pacific 15,000 feet below. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 seconds. But the night wasn't over. The Zero escort, either glimpsing the muzzle flash or seeing his bomber explode, had flipped over and disappeared. Mooney's voice came urgent through the headphones. "Look out, Hap, there's a Jap. Fighter on our tail!" The Japanese pilot had made a critical mistake. Instead of fleeing into the darkness where the Black Widow couldn't follow visually, he tried to engage, tried to fight using the old rules of night combat. He couldn't know that the American night fighter had redundant systems, that even if he damaged the radar, the dorsal turret could track independently, that 3 sets of eyes were watching for him instead of 1. Haberman threw Moon Happy into a power dive, using the Black Widow's weight to build speed. The Zero's guns chattered, but the burst went wide. Firing at night without tracers was like shooting blind. The Japanese pilot lost sight of his target almost immediately, and by the time he recovered, the Black Widow had vanished into the darkness below, using the one advantage the Zero couldn't match: altitude to trade for speed, backed by engines that wouldn't quit and systems that wouldn't fail. They returned to base 53 minutes after takeoff. Fuel remaining, enough for another hour of patrol. Ammunition expended, 600 rounds of 20mm. Status: 1 Betty bomber destroyed, 1 Zero escort evaded, 0 damage to Moon Happy. It was the first P-61 kill in the Pacific theater. It would be far from the last. The psychological impact of that kill rippled through both sides of the war. For American bomber crews who'd been enduring nightly harassment raids, the knowledge that something was finally hunting the hunters brought a sense of relief that no amount of anti-aircraft fire could provide. But for Japanese pilots, the appearance of the Black Widow represented something more disturbing than a new weapon. It represented the industrialization of night itself. In the weeks that followed Haberman's first kill, Japanese intelligence scrambled to understand what they were facing. Interrogations of downed American aircrews yielded nothing. The Black Widow program was classified, its capabilities unknown, even to most Allied personnel. Captured aircraft recognition manuals showed nothing like the twin-boom silhouette that survivors described seeing for split seconds before their squadrons were torn apart by invisible cannons. The Japanese had built their night operations around a philosophy of individual mastery. Their pilots trained for years, learning to navigate by stars, to judge altitude by the sound of their engines, to spot targets against moonlight through sheer force of skill and experience. It was an art form, refined through blood and necessity, and it had worked brilliantly against enemies who fought by the same rules. The Americans weren't playing by those rules. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura Shinji was one of the first to encounter the Black Widow and survive. His report, filed with the Imperial Japanese Navy's Night Fighter Command in August of 1944, reads like a ghost story. He'd been escorting a Betty bomber on a harassment raid against the newly captured Tinian airfield when his entire formation simply disappeared. No warning, no searchlights, no sound of engines approaching. One moment, his squadron leader was visible as a dark shape against the stars. The next, the night lit up with cannon fire from nowhere, and the bomber was tumbling toward the ocean in flames. Nakamura had executed an emergency dive, pushing his Zero to its limits, and survived only because he'd broken off the engagement immediately. "It was not a fighter," he wrote in his report. "Fighters must maneuver to engage. This thing simply appeared at ideal firing position, as if it could see through darkness itself." American radar had evolved beyond our intelligence estimates. Recommend immediate withdrawal from all night operations until countermeasures can be developed. His recommendation was ignored. Japan couldn't afford to abandon night harassment. It was one of the few tactics that still worked against overwhelming American air superiority. But Nakamura's report was circulated anyway, and word spread through the ranks. The Americans had a new night fighter. It was big, black, and could apparently see in the dark. Pilots began calling it the Kuroi Majo, the Black Witch, though when American translators later captured documents using the term, they'd mistranslate it as Black Widow, accidentally giving the P-61 a name that fit its nature perfectly. The technology gap wasn't just about radar. When Japanese mechanics finally examined a captured P-61 recovered from a forced landing on Leyte in October 1944, what they found was even more demoralizing than the radar itself. The ammunition bays carried more rounds than 3 Zeros combined. The oxygen system had redundant bottles with automatic regulators. The radios operated on multiple frequencies with crystal-clear fidelity. The hydraulic systems had backup pumps. The survival kit included a week's worth of rations, water purification tablets, morphine, sulfur, drugs, and a sidearm with spare magazines. And yes, there was a cigarette lighter built into the cockpit panel, an electrical coil that glowed red when activated, installed so the pilot could light a smoke during long patrols without fumbling for matches in the dark. That cigarette lighter became symbolic. Japanese engineers could understand the radar it was advanced, but conceptually similar to their own systems. They could understand the firepower, the redundant systems, even the three-man crew, but the cigarette lighter represented something that couldn't be reverse-engineered or copied. It represented the thinking of a nation so flush with resources that crew comfort during combat operations was considered a design priority. Worth the extra wiring, the extra weight, the extra manufacturing complexity, Japan was rationing aluminum, stripping non-essential equipment from aircraft to save weight, melting down temple bells for cannon barrels. And America was installing cigarette lighters in its night fighters. The technical report filed by the Japanese inspection team concluded with a single devastating sentence. This aircraft represents not superior engineering but superior capacity. We cannot match it because we cannot afford to think this way. By late 1944, the pattern was established. Japanese night raids that had once been merely dangerous became suicidal. Betty bombers that had harassed American positions with relative impunity found themselves intercepted before they reached their targets, destroyed by enemies they never saw, could never see, would never see until the cannon fire was already chewing through their wings. The mathematics were brutal. A Betty bomber cost approximately 150,000 yen to build and required a crew of 7 men who'd trained for months. A P-61 cost $75,000, roughly equivalent in purchasing power, but was far more likely to return from every mission. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan was losing bombers faster than factories could replace them, losing experienced crews that couldn't be replaced at all. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American P-61 squadrons, meanwhile, were accumulating kills with mechanical efficiency. The 621st Night Fighter Squadron, operating out of Biak, destroyed 8 Japanese aircraft in 5 days during December 1944. The 419th Squadron, based on Tacloban, intercepted a formation of 6 Betty bombers attempting a night raid and shot down 4 before the others fled. The 548th Squadron, stationed on Iishima, established a combat air patrol pattern that effectively created a no-fly zone over Okinawa after dark. These weren't dramatic dogfights. They were systematic, almost industrial in their execution. Ground radar would detect incoming raids. P-61 seconds would launch and climb to intercept altitude. Radar operators would guide pilots onto target. Cannons would fire. Japanese aircraft would burn. The cycle would repeat. The crew of Moonhappy, Haberman and Mooney eventually scored 4 confirmed kills, but they weren't the most successful Black Widow team. That distinction went to Major Carroll Smith and his radar operator Lieutenant Philip Porter, who scored 5 kills flying their P-61 over Mindoro in the Philippines. Smith's 5th kill, achieved on December 30th, 1944, was a Nakajima Ki-84 fighter that never detected the American night fighter until 20mm rounds began tearing through its fuselage. Smith's combat reports read like instruction manuals. Detected contact at bearing 090, range 6 miles. Close to 1,000 feet. Radar operator confirmed single-engine fighter. Opened fire at 700 feet. Target destroyed. Ammunition expended. 400. Rounds 20mm. Time from detection to kill, 8 minutes. There's no drama in the language, no excitement, just professional documentation of work performed. That was the terrifying thing about the Black Widow from a Japanese perspective. It had reduced night combat to procedure. The individual skill that Japanese pilots had spent years developing became irrelevant when the enemy could see you from 4 miles away and track you through clouds, darkness, and evasive maneuvers with electronic precision. The only defense was to stop flying at night entirely, and that's eventually what happened. By early 1945, Japanese night operations over American-held territory had effectively ceased. Not because they'd been defeated in battle, though they had, but because the cost of operating had become prohibitive. Sending bombers into areas patrolled by Black Widows was sending them to certain death, and Japan could no longer afford certain death when resources were already stretched to breaking. The final act in the Black Widow's Pacific War came on the night of August 14th, 1945. The war was officially over. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender that morning, but not every pilot had received the message, and American commanders weren't taking chances. Night fighters continued their patrols, watching for stragglers or holdouts, or simply aircraft whose crews hadn't yet accepted that the war was finished. Captain Lee Kendall and his radar operator, Lieutenant John Shearer, were flying Lady in the Dark, a P-61B that had become one of the most photographed Black Widows in the theatre, when they detected a single contact approaching Iishima, a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, flying alone, apparently trying to reach Okinawa on some final, pointless mission. Kendall didn't open fire immediately. He closed to identification range, hoping the Japanese pilot would see him and turn away. Instead, the Oscar pilot, perhaps thinking he was being pursued by a regular fighter that couldn't track him in darkness, began a series of desperate, evasive maneuvers, diving toward the wave tops, jinking left and right, trying every trick that had worked against American aircraft before the Black Widow arrived. None of it mattered. Lady in the Dark's radar tracked every maneuver. Kendall stayed locked on the Oscar's 6 o'clock, matching every turn, every dive, staying just close enough to maintain radar contact. The Japanese pilot pushed harder, dove steeper, turned tighter. Somewhere in that darkness, trying to shake a pursuer he couldn't see and couldn't lose, he misjudged his altitude. The Oscar struck the water at 200 miles per hour and exploded without Kendall ever firing a shot. It was credited as the last aerial kill of World War II, and it was accomplished by psychological pressure alone. The Japanese pilot had killed himself, trying to escape an enemy whose very existence represented everything Japan had been fighting against: superior technology, unlimited resources, and the kind of systematic efficiency that turned warfare into industrial process. The P-61 Black Widow destroyed 64 Japanese aircraft in just over a year of Pacific combat. Add in the European, Mediterranean, and China-Burma-India theaters, and the total reaches 127 enemy aircraft plus 18 V-1 buzz bombs. These numbers seem modest compared to the thousands of kills racked up by Mustangs and Thunderbolts in daylight operations. But consider what those numbers represent. Every single one of those 127 kills happened at night, in conditions where traditional fighters were useless. Every kill represented a bomber that didn't reach its target, a harassment raid that failed, a psychological blow to enemy pilots who discovered that darkness no longer protected them. More importantly, the Black Widow's impact went far beyond its kill count. Its mere existence forced Japan to abandon night operations entirely over American-controlled territory. It freed Allied ground forces and air bases from the constant psychological pressure of nocturnal harassment. It allowed bomber crews to sleep without fear of attack. It demonstrated that technology could overcome traditional martial virtues like skill, courage, and experience. The Japanese pilots who encountered the Black Widow understood this better than their commanders. They weren't being defeated by better pilots, they were being defeated by better systems. The individual Japanese aviator was probably as skilled as his American counterpart, maybe more so given the rigorous training regimen. But individual skill meant nothing when the opposing side could afford to build aircraft with redundant systems, advanced radar, more ammunition than you'd fire in 10 missions, and yes, cigarette lighters for crew comfort. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, who'd survived his encounter with the Black Widow in Nakamura, August of 1944, surrendered with his unit in September of 1945. In his papers, found by American translators after the war, was a letter he'd written but never sent to his family. In it, he tried to explain what it felt like to fight against the P-61. "We trained to be better," he wrote. "We studied harder, flew longer, practiced until every maneuver was perfect. And then we met an enemy who didn't care about better. They cared about enough. Enough aircraft that losing one didn't matter. Enough radar range that we were detected before we detected them. Enough ammunition that they could afford to miss. Enough redundancy that a single failure wouldn't doom them. This is not a war anymore. It is production, and we are being outproduced into extinction." That letter captures the fundamental truth about the Black Widow's place in history. It wasn't the most famous fighter of the war. It didn't inspire songs or paintings. Only 706 were ever built, a tiny fraction compared to other American fighters. But for the pilots who faced it, and especially for the Japanese aviators who learned what it meant to be hunted by technology they couldn't match, the P-61 became something more than an aircraft. It became proof that the war had been decided not by courage or skill or fighting spirit, but by industrial capacity, by a nation that could afford to engineer solutions to every problem, that could build machines so over-equipped that they included creature comforts other countries couldn't imagine, that could replace every loss and still have resources left over for the next generation of weapons. The Black Widow was democracy flying at 300 miles per hour, armed with radar and cannons, and yes, cigarette lighters. And it had come to the Pacific not just to defeat Japan's night fighters, but to demonstrate that superior resources properly applied would always triumph over superior dedication. That's the lesson Japanese pilots learned in the darkness over Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa, and 100 other islands. That's what made 64 kills feel like 600. In the end, the P-61 wasn't just hunting Japanese aircraft. It was hunting the very idea that willpower and training could overcome material disadvantage. And like everything else it hunted in those dark Pacific skies, that idea died without seeing what killed it, destroyed by an enemy that could see in the dark and had built the tools to prove it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.